Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. This episode is brought to you by Wondrium, a series of college-level audio and video courses and documentaries produced and distributed by the Teaching Company. Wondrium brings you engaging educational content through short-form videos, long-form courses, I've done 2, tutorials, how-to lessons, travelogues, documentaries, and more, covering every topic you've ever wondered about, and probably a bunch you've never wondered about. Here's one that I just found that popped up on my app. This Day in History, May. Okay, so here we are, May of 2022. And they have, for example, May 14th coming up, 1607, Jamestown Colony founded. May 18th, 1980, Mount St. Helens erupts. Remember when that happened? That was a big story. May 11th, 1997, Deep Blue defeats Garry Kasparov. Yes, that was the first of the AI as an existential threat because it can win at chess. Well, that hasn't happened yet, but still an impressive feat. May 17th, 1954, Brown versus Board of Education decided. That was huge in terms of the desegregation of schools. May 29th, 1453, Constantinople falls to the Ottomans. Major episode in world history. May 14th, 1796, the first vaccine is administered. That seems relevant for current events. And then finally, May 25th, 1787, the U.S. Constitutional Convention begins. Each of these is like 5 or 6 minutes long. You could just bang these out as you're driving to work, vacuuming the house, doing a workout, going shopping, anything. I listen to content constantly, probably 2-3 hours every day of all sorts. Anyway, check out Wondrium. It's great. And if you do so through the podcast, if you go to wondrium.com/Shermer, you get the free trial and you get the greatly discounted over half off the annual subscription rate. This is how it works, everywhere now. Everybody has an annual subscription rate that gets you access to all their content, which is just endless. And it's, way better than any of the other sites you'll find online for that. And the price is quite reasonable. Anyway, go to wondrium.com/Shermer, get that free trial, sign up for that discounted annual subscription, and check it out. You can always stop the system if you want, but why would you want to? It's great. I use it all the time. All right, check it out. Thanks for listening. If you support the podcast, here's our next episode.
Moshe Hoffman is a research scientist at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Biology, a research fellow at MIT's Sloan School of Management, and a lecturer at Harvard's Department of Economics. His research focuses on using game theory, models of learning and evolution, and experimental methods to decipher the motives that shape our social behavior, preferences, and ideologies. He lives in Lubeck, Germany. Erez Yoeli is a research scientist at MIT's Sloan School of Management, the director of MIT's Applied Cooperation Team, and a lecturer at Harvard's Department of Economics as well. His research focuses on altruism, understanding how it works and how to promote it. Yoeli collaborates with governments, nonprofits, and companies to apply the lessons of this research toward addressing real-world challenges, and he lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So we discuss game theory, how it developed and what it is exactly, the different components and elements and jargon that goes a long ways to explaining how rational or irrational an animal we are. Discuss bounded rationality, that is to say we are rational under certain conditions, not so much in other conditions. We discuss altruism, reciprocal altruism, and kin selection, deception and self-deception, costly signaling theory, pirate rationality. Yes, even pirates have rational reasons for what they do. Virtue signaling and costly signaling as they go together. Irrational wars like the Falkland Wars and Iraq and Afghanistan and the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So we apply game theory to explain why politicians do such things. We discuss internalized misogyny and racism, systemic racism, the implicit association test, to what extent game theory enlightens us on some of those ideas, mutual assured destruction, the game theory behind the Cold War, which still maybe is going on again now, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and how game theory can possibly get us to a solution to that. And then we kind of wrap up talking about some of the larger issues of our time in this context. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. I certainly did. Thanks for listening. And if you appreciate the podcast, please do go to skeptic.com/donate and support the organization. That way, your donations are tax deductible. Here we go. We're live. Gentlemen, nice to see you. Congratulations on the new book, Hidden Games, The Surprising Power of Game Theory to Explain Irrational Human Behavior. I love the book. I listened to the whole thing in one 24-hour period at 1.4 speed. How's that for an ultramarathon?
Yes, I understand that you're experienced at those.
Yeah, I have a little bit of experience at that. That's right. Yeah, exactly. So, well, I love game theory because it gives us a theoretical model that can then test different specific human actions and behaviors that we're curious about. But before we get there, just give us a little bit of background. Each of you, just maybe a brief biography, where you were born and raised and where you went to school and what got you interested in psychology and economics and game theory.
So I was actually raised in Los Angeles as an ultra-Orthodox Jew.
Wow.
And I guess midway through high school, midway through high school, I got into your books, Richard Dawkins' books, Matt Ridley, a few like this. And I guess it didn't take me long to drop my religious beliefs and, decide that I wanted to devote myself to scientific pursuits. I loved game theory because I guess I first heard about it in Dawkins, The Selfish Gene. He was talking about reciprocal altruism and animal territoriality and animal sex ratio, stuff like that. And so ever since, I've kind of been very interested in that subject. I remember when I first got to college, asking, the college counselor, how can I apply game theory to study human social behavior? What should I study to do that? And she was like, I have no clue. And so I figured, okay, I'll take a game theory course. And for that, you had some econ prerequisites. And before I knew it, I was an econ major, then got my PhD in econ at University of Chicago. That's what I've been interested in ever since, applying game theory to understanding human social behavior.
I was born in Israel, made my way to the U.S. as a young kid. I was originally a musician, and then ended up deciding to switch gears in college in my first semester, and switched to a regular college. So then I was taking a whole bunch of different classes because I had no idea what I wanted to be, and took some econ classes and really liked it. Took some game theory classes, and in fact didn't really like that until I met this guy. And the reason was because all the different applications that I was being presented with during my classes were the stuff that I thought wasn't so interesting to me, like auctions, or occasionally they talk about some statescraft stuff, which I guess right now might be very interesting given what's going on in Ukraine, but wasn't the stuff that I was most interested in. And then when this guy started telling me about the applications he'd read about and that he was trying to incorporate into his classes, that really piqued my interest. I got interested in that. Also, a bit of an accident that I became an economist. I basically didn't know what to do and kept taking econ classes. The next thing I knew, I had an econ PhD. I worked for the Federal Trade Commission for a while. I was fighting fraud. And then we decided we would pitch a class to MIT together around this question of, can you use game theory but for these slightly different applications? And MIT gave us a holler. They said, "You guys want to teach this for real?" So I went to my boss at the FTC and said, "I'm gonna go up for 3 months. I'll be back in 3 months." And I never.
But Moshe, your bio says you live in Lubeck, Germany. Is that right? And so you're just visiting MIT at the moment?
Yeah, well, I am visiting at the moment. I'll be teaching. Our class moved from MIT to Harvard a few years ago, and I'll be at Harvard teaching that in the fall. So I guess I spent some time here, some time in Germany, but they only let us put one on the back of the book.
Oh, I see. Okay, right. Well, my wife's from Cologne, Germany, so that's why I asked. And if you were born and raised in LA, somehow you mastered German. I have just not been able to do it. That is a difficult language.
I mastered the fact that I could be a spoiled American and rely on other people knowing English.
So do you consider yourself now an atheist or like a secular Jew, or how do you think about your religious attitude?
Yeah, atheist. I mean, I guess, in academia, nobody even asked you that because it's just kind of assumed. But yes, ever since I was about 15, I've considered myself an atheist, and I've had the privilege of being, at the University of Chicago where everybody is, and I guess now living in Europe, I also, it's nice to be around other secular people with a secular worldview. It's not what I grew up with, and I guess what we're seeing now in America, it's a little bit it's a little bit scary, and it's one advantage of being in Europe is you have less of that.
Oh, for sure, way more secular, particularly in Germany. And Jennifer tells me that the people are leaving the Catholic Church in droves because of all the sex scandals and all that stuff. But in general, the rise of the nuns in America has been encouraging. It's probably over a third of millennials, maybe half of Gen Zs belong to no religious affiliation. They're not necessarily atheists. They're not joining Skeptic magazine and following Richard Dawkins but maybe they follow Deepak Chopra or something. But I ask because a lot of almost all my Jewish friends are atheists, but they're they respect religion, the culture, the traditions, the holidays, still have value. So I always try to think about religion as, well, what does it serve? Maybe this is a gateway to game theory. Really, what's the purpose of religion? What does it do? It does a lot for people, I think, even if you don't believe in a Godhead.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that there's fairly good evidence that religion helps people kind of form a community and cooperate with each other and trust each other. And, a lot of times the belief system kind of helps, in some sense, keep people in line. It helps motivate people to kind of do what's communally beneficial. With the, downside, though, that oftentimes that comes at the expense of people outside of the community. So it tends to be religious people are very good cooperators to insiders, but not so cooperative to outsiders, and yeah.
Yeah, that's Paul Bloom's against empathy argument, right? That it increases empathy within groups, but outgroupness and xenophobia against people in other groups. So, Erez, is it Erez or Erez? How do you pronounce your name?
Erez.
Erez, yes.
Just
good.
the Z.
Yeah, just the Z, Erez. So, and so let me ask you the same question, because, you're born and raised in Israel. So there's a strong religious component there, obviously. But again, I know that the rates of atheism are probably higher there than in America. And yet there's still a strong cultural tradition. How do you think about that?
Yeah, my family came from a socialist background. My grandparents were founders of kibbutzim. In fact, I'm named after kibbutz Erez, which is where they met and sort of spent their formative years. Wow. And I guess as a consequence of that, we had almost anti-religious views and took those for granted growing up. And it was only later that when one began to study religions from a more scientific standpoint that one understood, okay, religions do have benefits, even if I, at a personal level, had grown up kind of being antagonistic towards them.
Some people have described Marxism as sort of an ersatz religion, or a religion-like worldview.
Yeah, if you've ever met my grandmother, I think that's definitely true.
What? Really?
Yeah. Oh, she'll rail against the man. She'll talk about all these corporate interests taking over power structures. I mean,
right.
She knows the lingo.
Right. Oh, that's too funny. Yeah. Well, so in a way, I guess the seg into game theory is religion provides something of an incentive structure for enforcing the rules of cooperation, rewarding altruism, and signaling to your fellow group members you can be relied on. If I see you every week in the religious ceremony and you're following the rituals, I know I can count on you. So let's enter game theory there. How do you think about religion in a game theory sense, and maybe explain the basics of game theory for listeners not familiar with it?
Sure, I got this one. The game's got 3 parts. It's got players. They choose between different actions, and they also will get payoffs. And in order to make this game theory, there are 2 key things we have to add to that. Number 1 is those payoffs will depend not just on the actions that they choose, but also on what other people are doing. And that's really what makes game theory good for studying social situations. That's what it was designed for. And the other thing is, game theory assumes that when players choose their actions, they do so optimally in some sense. So they have to actually choose the action that's as good as possible for them, holding constant what other people are doing.
So maybe it'll help to give an example. So a classic game that your audience might have heard about is, I guess, the Prisoner's Dilemma. Another classic game is the Hawk-Dove game. Okay, and so actually we have a chapter that goes into the Hawk-Dove game. It's a pretty simple game, but it has a lot of insight, a lot of bang for your buck. So I'll explain the game and a few of the insights because I think it kind of really illustrates the power of game theory quite well. So in the Hawk-Dove game, there's two animals or people fighting over some kind of scarce resource, like a piece of meat or a piece of land.
So those are your players.
Mm-hmm. And then there's two actions available. You can either behave very aggressively, like a hawk might, to fight for the piece of meat or the piece of land, or very dovishly, exactly. You kind of like skulk away, or you don't really fight that hard for it. Okay, so those are the two actions. And then the way the payoffs work is it's assumed that the item has some value, you can call that V, and there's a cost of fighting. If we both get in a tussle, maybe I'll end up with a scar, I could be maimed, one of us might die, so there's some cost C, okay, of getting in a fight. And it's assumed that if we both play Hawk, we get in a fight, and maybe it's kind of random who wins the object, or maybe we split it, but we have to pay this cost C, okay? And then if I play Hawk and the other player, say Erez, plays Dove, then I get the object, he doesn't, and no fight ensues. Okay, so I get value V, he gets value 0, whereas in the other case we both play Hawk, I get value V over 2, he gets value V over 2, but we both pay some cost C. Okay, and then another possibility is, of course, he plays Hawk and I play Dove, and a final possibility is we both play Dove, which means that again we might randomize who gets the object or split it, but there's no cost of fighting. Okay, and game theory says, well, it's not so obvious what's optimal in this situation, but it says actually so long as the object isn't too valuable relative to the cost of fighting, V has to be small relative to C, then there's two equilibria of this game. Okay? There's two ways we can specify our behavior such that nobody could benefit from unilaterally deviating. That's how Nash equilibria are defined. One Nash equilibria of this game is I play Hawk and Erez plays Dove. Okay, in that case, he can't benefit from deviating because if he switches to playing Hawk, then yes, he has some chance of getting the object, but we get in a tussle, and that's assumed to not be worth it. Okay, and I can't benefit from deviating because I'm already in the best case scenario. I get the object, and I don't have to pay any cost of fighting. Okay, so neither of us would want to deviate. This is kind of a self-sustaining equilibrium, and vice versa. If he plays Hawk and I play Dove, it's also a Nash equilibrium. And so what's surprising about this game and why it has so much insight is there's two Nash equilibria that are kind of totally different from each other. In one case, I get the object. In the other case, he doesn't. And all that really matters is which one we expect to play. Okay? And so arbitrary things that dictate who plays Hawk and who plays Dove, can be self-fulfilling. And so this is used to explain why animals have territoriality. The one that arrives first, even if it offers no advantage in defending the territory, will still play Hawk, and the other will still play Dove. They'll leave the territory if they see that you're already there. And so this idea of territoriality can be explained with this very, very simple model. And likewise, we use it in the book to explain things like our own intuitions about property rights. So if Erez, for instance, goes to the movie theater and he wants to, get up to buy some popcorn, he might leave his jacket on the seat. Okay. And in our culture, we assume that the person who left their jacket on the seat, if they come back and you're sitting in that seat, they might behave very aggressively. They might say, hey, what are you doing? That's my seat. And, I might see that jacket there and assume that Erez is going to defend the seat very aggressively. I might, not want to risk a fight, and I'll just leave his jacket there. So this random, arbitrary social norm about leaving your jacket to save a seat, even though there's no law or police that would enforce that norm, it's kind of self-fulfilling because, it's not worth starting a fight over. And so our own intuitions about mine and thine can be shaped similar to animal territoriality from this logic of Hawk-Dove. And hopefully that kind of illustrates the power of game theory.
Yeah, that's really nice. I'm going to drill down to how this is built into our human nature, starting with Richard Dawkins, because you talk about Dawkins in his book, The Selfish Gene. Here, I'm just kind of reading my own summary of this, that
A cell or a body or an organism, a survival machine, is the gene's way of surviving and perpetuating itself. Genes that code for proteins that build survival machines that live long enough for them to reproduce will win out over genes that do not. Genes that code for proteins and enzymes that protect its survival machine from assaults such as disease help not just the organism to survive, but the genes as well. Survival, reproduction, flourishing. This is what survival machines do by their very nature. It is their and our essence to strive to survive. The problem is that survival machines scurrying around us in, say, a liquid environment such as an ocean or pond will bump into other survival machines, all of whom are competing for the same limited resources. Quote from Dawkins, to a survival machine, another survival machine, which is not its own child or another close relative, is part of its environment, like a rock or a river or a lump of food. But there's a difference between a survival machine and a rock. A survival machine is inclined to hit back if exploited. This is because it too is a machine that holds its immortal genes in trust for the future, and it too will stop at nothing to preserve them. Thus, Dawkins concludes, natural selection favors genes that control their survival machines in such a way that they make the best use of their environment. This includes making the best use of other survival machines, both of the same and of different species. So this is this idea of self and other. I want what's best for me and my kin and kind, but you want what's best for you and your kin and kind. So therein lies the conflict of which your theory explains how these things get resolved. It's built into our nature. And inevitably, we're going to have conflict.
Yeah. Well, I love that you spelled out that whole quote, and hopefully your audience can see why I fell in love with game theory reading Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene. He really does such a beautiful job laying out why it's relevant for evolutionary processes in animal behavior and other organisms. And he does a really good job, talking about all these cool applications like territoriality that I mentioned before. He's got, some great discussion of that in his book. He talks about costly signaling, why peacocks have, these long, elaborate tails that make them worse at flying and, more attractive to predators. It's kind of a big puzzle. Why birds chirp, which also attracts predators. Why, you have 50-50 sex ratios, about the same number of males as females in most species. So all these great applications of game theory to biology, Dawkins does a really good job highlighting. One thing we try to do in our book is talk about, Erez mentioned you kind of have two assumptions that make game theory particularly relevant. One is the payoffs are interactive, which, nicely spelled out in that quote you mentioned. Another is that you have some kind of optimization process. And again, the whole idea of the selfish gene, is spelling out evolution, optimizes this notion of, what's good for the gene. And that's going to make game theory very relevant for biology. And so one thing we try to do in the book is we kind of talk about, there are various optimization processes. Evolutionary biology is a really cool one, and that's going to optimize something like, what's good for the gene, some notion of, fitness. There are other ways you could apply game theory, other ways to justify optimization. The one that's most kind of common and intuitive to economists is this idea that, firms can sit around, CEOs and a board can sit around a boardroom and decide what's optimal for the firm. And they're maximizing not biological fitness, they're maximizing something like profit. And the optimization process isn't something like biological evolution, it's something like our conscious ability to deliberate and calculate and, debate, among the board and use Excel sheets or whatever to come up with the best way to get the most profit, given that other firms might be competing with us or might be trying to, undercut our prices or things like that. Game theory is going to come into play there too. There's a third process that we talk about in the book that also makes game theory relevant. This is the idea that humans are very good at learning. We're very good at learning from others through imitation or through instruction. And we're very good at learning from our own experience through things like reinforcement learning processes, trial and error. And these processes are also very good at figuring out what's optimal. And in social settings, therefore, they're going to kind of also be consistent with Nash equilibria. But now you're going to kind of optimize something slightly different from, profits or biological fitness. And we have a bit of a discussion about what that would be. And And so we kind of talk about this notion of primary rewards, which is kind of these things that we evolved to care about, like mating opportunities and status and access to resources like food and safety and health. Those are things we evolved to care about, but then kind of take on a life of their own because they shape and bias our learning processes, what we learn to like and believe. And so that's another way in which game theory comes into play. But notice in these three different applications, there's kind of a different justification for using game theory and a different interpretation of what counts as the payoffs.
That's perfect.
That helps.
That nicely outlines it. So there's no, let's say, utopian solutions. There's just trade-offs. The peacock's large tail is going to be costly for predation, but payoff for female selection is more than the cost of the predation. So that's what wins out. So it's all kind of a trade-off in evolution.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk about fingernails?
Yeah, the fingernails. That's a good.
That's exactly right. I mean, the example you're highlighting is one of the main benefits of game theory is highlighted by this example, which is that it will allow you to kind of laser in on the costs and benefits. Another example that we just referenced is that of long fingernails, which are pretty common across many cultures, in particular amongst men. So in rural Egypt, it's common for men to grow long fingernails, in particular long pinky nails. You'll find this in Northeast India. Mo actually encountered this while doing research out there. You'll also find this in rural China. And the nails will end up being about maybe 3/4 of an inch to an inch long. And if you ask people why they grow their nails long, they'll typically just tell you that they find this attractive. But obviously we don't find this attractive, so there's something funky going on there. And when Mo and his then advisor, Uri Ganizi, asked people some additional questions, they started to get a hint of the answer. What they found was that everybody who had these long fingernails, they had desk jobs. They were teachers, they were the mayor, or they were a secretary or something like that. And everybody who didn't have them, they were rice farmers. And obviously it's going to be a lot harder to grow a really long fingernail if you're a farmer because you have your hands in the dirt all the time and you're pretty likely to break the fingernail. It's going to be discolored and things like that. So some folks can grow these fingernails and some folks can't, just like the peacocks. Some of those peacocks are fit enough that they can grow really beautiful tails. They can afford that cost, and some of them can't.
But I just kind of want to use this example to highlight, with peacocks, they're behaving consistent with the Nash equilibrium here, which, the model here is the Coste signaling model. And they're doing what's optimal, not because they've thought through, or even because they've learned. They just, they'll grow a long tail if they're fit, and the females are going to be attracted to the males with the long tails, because that's a good way to figure out which males are more fit. And so, biological evolution gets to the Coste signaling Nash equilibria with peacocks. In the case of the fingernails, it can't be biologically evolved because, like Erez mentioned, we don't have that same taste. That taste is very culture specific. It's kind of specific to these agrarian economies, and not shared by everybody. And so that suggests that something else must be doing the optimization there. And so something like cultural evolution. And there's another. I guess many of your audience will probably have heard about Coste signaling in another application, like conspicuous consumption, like why we have Rolex watches and like very fancy cars. And there it seems like maybe it's cultural or biologically evolved that we have these tastes, but some of it that might actually just be conscious optimization. So like you could even think through, like if I have this fancy watch, other people will be able to tell that I'm very rich, and that might be good to signal. And so that's a case where arguably maybe there's kind of more of a conscious element to the optimization. And so we like this example because it kind of illustrates these different processes can all lead to Nash equilibrium and Coste signaling coming into play. They work, slightly different, but Nash has many ways of coming into play.
Right. So wearing a Rolex watch, it's kind of irrational because I could buy a $10 watch and it'll tell time. Actually, I don't have to have a watch at all now. The smartphone gives me perfect time. Right. But it has a payoff otherwise. Apparently, this signals higher status amongst my fellow males, and maybe it attracts females because they want somebody who's high status that has resources. And the Rolex watch is a signal to a certain level of status. So that has kind of a value. So again, it's all trade-off. I was just thinking of some other examples here. I think in your book you talked about tanning. These are so cultural.
I think it was in the 19th century, right? It was not good to have a tan. It was better to be pasty white because it means you're not one of the common workers outside. And then in the mid 20th century or something that shifted. Now it's cool to be tan, or weight, kind of weight you should have,
Exactly,
and that sort of thing. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so in most cultures, even today, although that is shifting, you'll find that beauty is associated with fairer skin. And in fact, there's a billions and billions of dollar industry around making your skin fairer. And historically in Western culture also, as you just referenced, there would have been a preference for fairer skin. But obviously most of us, we have internalized the opposite preference. We like going to the beach, getting a tan. We feel like we glow then, things like that. So that's the tanning example. A similar thing with BMI. Also, historically, we would have had a preference, and many cultures still do. If you go to Ethiopia, rural Ethiopia, for instance, or actually you can go to Western Africa as well, you'll find cultures where there's a real emphasis on heavier BMIs, and that's what people find beautiful. If you want to find a mate right around mating time, you'll actually even have like a fattening culture. And in our culture as well, if you look, for instance, at Renaissance paintings, the folks being painted were typically a bit heavier. But nowadays we think of folks who are the most beautiful as being fit and thin. So we have this shift, and probably that reflects, again, something about the underlying costs. Historically, people didn't have access to enough calories. Historically, people would have had jobs outdoors and would have been naturally tan, and so only the people who could stay indoors all day could afford to have this nice pasty white skin. Ironically, the thing we don't find attractive anymore.
Let me just add again. It seems here that you need something like cultural evolution at play. It's not like we're consciously deciding to like tan skin or fair skin. That's just, it's kind of a taste that we have and that we develop from imitating others, or from, watching what pop stars do, or movie stars, or whatever, or our friends. And it's culturally learned. And it's not biologically ingrained, right? This taste, again, it varies. And maybe one other thing to highlight from these examples is, as is often the case when things are kind of learned, is it gets internalized. Like, you're not consciously thinking, oh, I'm doing this to signal that I don't have to have a job out in the field, or I don't need to signal that anymore because very few people in my culture have agricultural jobs. Like, none of that is conscious. Instead, it's embedded in our taste. Like, it's just like, I like this. I find this more attractive. Like, it feels cool to like go to the beach and tan. And so that kind of internalization often happens, and that's what makes the game theory often hidden. Because it gets embedded into our tastes, or our ideologies, or our belief systems, or our intuitions.
Yeah, I liked your examples of pirates. One of my favorite books was Pete Leeson's book, The Invisible Hook, about the culture of pirates. And why would a pirate ship fly the skull and crossbones flag, basically signaling, we are pirates and we're coming to take you and take your stuff. And his argument was that they don't actually want to have conflict. They would like to just steal your stuff and not have you fight back. And so if they cultivate a reputation of being badasses by occasionally being badasses, then waving the flag means you're likely to think, well, it's probably better if we just give them our stuff and hope they go away, and then there's less violence. And so there's kind of a payoff for the pirates to have that signal flying, literally costly signaling flying on their ship. And then, but he also talks about the kind of culture of honor amongst the thieves themselves, that they had these kind of constitutions on the ship where everybody had to promise, we will obey these rules. And maybe you leg back when we board the other ship, you're hiding back in your room because you don't want to have that conflict. But if I see you legging back, then we're going to put social pressure on you, or maybe not give you as much of the loot because you didn't participate. So talk about that, and also the kind of norms that develop. You talked about cattlemen. Before the long arm of the law reached the western states, cattlemen and miners, they had their own set of rules and customs. I guess you wouldn't call them laws, but what to do if your cattle escapes, and where our border is, and how those things are determined.
Absolutely. You're referencing a part of the book where what we're talking about is the diversity of ways in which societies tend to enforce norms. So, for instance, when it comes to pirates, one of the things that people found surprising is if they were captives on a pirate ship, they discovered that the ship was actually really orderly, more orderly than merchant ships or actually Navy vessels of the time. The pirates seemed to do their work willingly. They did it on time. They went to bed on time. If you wanted to continue to play at cards or gamble, you had to go do it upstairs, and on some ships it wasn't even allowed. So there were these very, very strong norms. And pirates had, as you mentioned, these constitutions that helped them to develop these structures that made them good at enforcing these norms. They had particular individuals whose responsibility was to enforce certain behaviors, and then they had some other individuals whose responsibility was more martial. The captain actually was responsible for fighting and deciding which ships to take on, whereas there was a quartermaster who was responsible for order for the ship, and that was like a check and a balance that was interesting, and so on and so forth. So there's one society that has developed these cultural institutions that allows them to informally enforce all these rules. They don't really need like a police force and things like that. Beyond that, they kind of get together and do it. And then when it comes to cattlemen, we have a similar set. Ultimately what they're doing is they're solving a social good problem. That you need order on the ship in order to be effective pirates. You need order in the backcountry, I guess the hill country, in order to be able to raise your cattle and not for people to constantly be in conflict. So again, there's this set of norms that arise amongst the cattlemen. In that case, it was neighborly norms. If your cattle, what happens with cattlemen is that in most places you don't have fences. You just kind of let the cattle go. And if you do that, there's a risk that the cattle will trample something that somebody was trying to, those carrots that you've been trying to grow all summer suddenly went kaput because one cow went down the wrong lane. And the cattlemen have this very strong norm, even till today, it turns out. So even though the law has arrived and they're not typically required to do this, the cattlemen will come and they will effectively compensate you for this, and they will help you fix the problem. And if they don't do that, other cattlemen show up and kind of like pressure them to do that. They'll do this in subtle ways at first, eventually not so subtle ways. There's these great stories about one guy who kept ignoring these norms, and so his neighbors used to wear T-shirts that said, eat that guy's beef, everybody else does it, because they would just steal his cows. And so these societies develop these ways to enforce these norms. But the way that we use this, though, in the book is in order to get at one core feature, or I guess maybe two core features of norms that are very closely related, which are, in order to enforce a norm, you need punishment and rewards. Somebody does a good thing, they do the behavior that's necessary, they need to be rewarded or punished for it in some way. And the other thing you need is you need to punish the punishers or reward those punishers in some way.
So we referenced in the first half of our convo this idea of third-party punishment. That's punishing people who violate the norms, and higher order punishment. That's punishing people who fail to punish when they should, or somehow incentivizing. I guess that generalizes to the kind of examples Erez is giving. Is you need to kind of incentivize both the people to abide by the norm and also the enforcers. You kind of need both those features. And
what these societies have developed is good ways to do that.
Right. So all that has to be public amongst the participants in the game. In this case, ranching and farming and so forth. So what do we need the law for? What do we need the federal government for? Why can't communities just work out their norms, and that should be as high up as, in the order as it goes?
Yeah.
Well, norms are awesome in that they allow you to do all this stuff, but at the same time, norms have constraints. They're not. They require this like coordinated effort amongst all of us, and we can only really reward stuff if we're all on the same page that it should be rewarded. And that need to coordinate actually has a downside. It means that there's only certain kinds of things that we can coordinate. So sometimes that's good enough, but sometimes there's certain kinds of things we might want to enforce where it's easier to do that using unilateral enforcement. Maybe the categorical norms is an example.
Yeah, and loopholes.
And loopholes, yeah. So one example that we talk about in the book is this idea of a categorical norm. I'll just give an example to make this concrete. So since between the two world wars, between World War I and World War II, I'm sad that I even need to specify that because there might be a third one coming. And there was this agreement between all the world powers that we would no longer use chemical weapons because they'd been so terrible in World War I. That's a categorical norm. We're not going to use a category of weapon. You could think, wait a minute, actually what we're going to do is we're not going to use weapons that cause a certain amount of suffering or a particular weapon kills more than a certain number of people at once. That would be a norm that's based on a continuous variable, the amount of suffering or the number of people killed. It turns out that in general, we have a lot of the time our norms tend to be conditioned on these kind of categorical variables. Another example may be something like murder. We have a norm against murdering. We don't have a norm against killing people who aren't too old, something like that, right? Where again, you could, or maybe a norm against not killing people as long as they're sufficiently sentient. That's not the norm.
A utilitarian might say you should weigh off like their quality life years against, if you can take out the organs and hand them out, maybe you can, get enough benefit to make it worth it. No, we say murder is murder is murder. Even if they only have a day left to live, it's evil.
So to bring this back to your question, one of the constraints that game theory teaches us that norms have is that because of this coordination element that I was referencing earlier, is the fact that they have to be categorical. But sometimes you might actually rather have a continuous norm. Sometimes you might want to
do the
condition on a
efficient utilitarian thing, for instance.
To do the utilitarian thing. One concrete case where this happens in the United States is the EPA actually wants to allow a certain amount of emissions, but it's really more than a certain amount that we need to stop. And so there we have this continuous variable, and we would like to allow a little bit, because if you allow 0, then you can't do anything. But after a certain point, you stop. That kind of norm would be difficult to enforce, but if you have this top-down enforcement, an EPA that shows up and the man shows up and says, "Hey, I'm going to fine you if your thing exceeds my measurement. I don't need to coordinate this with anyone." Then you can actually enforce that. So there are sometimes benefits to having a government.
So let me mention one other downside to coordinated norms that are enforced in a distributed, coordinated fashion from a community and not top down from like a government. So we talked about religion in the first half of our conversation, and religions also, as we discussed, enforce norms on their members. So for instance, a norm that you don't do certain activities on Shabbat. If you're an Orthodox Jew, you can't turn on the lights or cook or things like that. Or as an Orthodox Jewish woman, you have to dress a certain way, what they term modest. You have to cover your hair when you're married, and your elbows and your knees and your collarbone, things like that. And what's common in these kind of norms that are enforced communally, like by a religious community, is people find loopholes. And it's really, really hard to prevent people from finding loopholes. So for instance, in Orthodox Judaism, one loophole is, we talk about the Shabbos goy, which is, you're not allowed to turn on your light on Shabbat, but, well, that applies to Jews, so you can just go and ask your non-Jewish neighbor to turn it on for you. And that's a loophole that people have found if their light's on and they want it off, is, they can ask for a goy, a non-Jewish person, to do it for them. Or another loophole is, women are supposed to cover their hair when they're married. But, women, like all people, I guess, want to look attractive, or at least many women do. And, covering your hair might make that a little bit harder. So, okay, what's a good loophole? Well, you can wear a wig. Now, the intent of the law originally was presumably to make you less attractive, at least to people who want your partner. A wig kind of, defeats that purpose, especially if it's if you're a 50, 60-year-old woman and the wig is from a 20-year-old girl, much longer than you can grow your hair. That's a loophole that violates the spirit of the law, the intent of the law, presumably, but still technically your hair is covered. It's just covered by somebody else's hair that's more attractive than your own. So these kind of loopholes always show up in religions and also show up in norms more broadly. And they're really hard to prevent when all you can do is coordinated enforcement. And the logic there is just, and I guess the logic with categorical norms, why norms are categorical, is if we need to coordinate on enforcing things, we need to agree when a violation has occurred. If my whole motive for punishing you for violating is I want to, also seem like a good community member who's enforcing these norms, I don't want to get punished myself for failing to enforce, I want to get rewarded for enforcing, well, I'm only going to want to do that if I think others will agree with me that the norm was violated. And when it's categorical, it's well defined, it's very clear when something is violated, we can coordinate better, and I can know, okay, this norm was violated, it's a whole new category. If I punish here, everybody will be in agreement with me. Whereas with continuous variables, it's a little bit harder. A utilitarian judgment, maybe your assessment of what's utilitarian, I slightly disagree with. It's kind of hard to calculate, quality life years or things like that. And likewise with loopholes, like, it's a little bit hard to know, well, does asking a non-Jewish person to turn off your lights, does that violate the intent of the law? I don't know. Like, well, did I ask them? Did they just like choose to do it, out of their own volition as a favor to me? Did I, I hinted at it, but, so you get into these questions and it's a little bit less clear cut. It's harder for people to coordinate on saying, oh, you violated the rules of Shabbat. And so that's the idea, is norms that are enforced communally, it's kind of harder to enforce loopholes, and it's harder to enforce this kind of continuous variation. And so we kind of now are restricted to norms. The norms that we can enforce are restricted and not maybe what you would want to do if you could design them top down.
Yeah, at a debate I was doing with a theist on the existence of God and the necessity of religion and so on, I was kind of rattling off religious craziness, one of which was the Mormon underwear. And in the Q&A, a young woman came up to the microphone and said, well, it's not crazy because I'm wearing it now. Of course, I couldn't tell. She's fully dressed. And so no one would know if she's wearing the Mormon underwear or not. But it was a way, she said, of honoring and respecting her religion. So in a way, even if nobody knows you're doing it, when you do it, it's kind of reinforcing your own belief, if I'm getting that right. That is, you'll be a better group member, and maybe you'll give off cues that you are genuine in your belief if you really believe. And one way to really believe is to just go through it even if nobody knows you're doing it. So that's kind of that question of deception and self-deception. If you believe the lie or whatever, the tenet of whatever the claim is, then you're less likely to give off cues to your fellow group members that you're just pretending. And so it's better to actually believe.
Yeah. I think there's several interesting things that go on with that example. I think one of which I like that you brought up, which we talk about also a lot in our book, this idea from Trivers and Bill von Hippel, that if we're trying to persuade other people, say that we hold this belief, it really helps if you yourself actually, convince yourself and, buy into your own propaganda. And that's a very powerful theory. It can explain a lot of our own biased or fallacious beliefs. I think another thing that could be going on here that might be interesting is just in general, like we were talking about before with the fingernails. Like sometimes, if things are driven by game theory, but you're getting to the game theory from cultural learning or reinforcement learning, those processes kind of by their nature are imperfect. They're kind of they have what we might refer as spillover effects or lag effects. It takes time for those things to optimize, and they don't optimize perfectly based on context, because they're embedding in things like your tastes or your beliefs. And so, which is why somebody, who develops this taste for these long fingernails, they might move to a different country, and it might take them, a little while to adjust their own sense of style. Maybe they won't adjust and only their kids will adjust, or their grandkids. And so you have kind of these lag effects. And that's common when cultural evolution is doing the work. And so it could be the same with these religious beliefs, is, if the beliefs tend to be reinforced, you'll still internalize it, you still might actually believe it, and then sometimes it'll spill over into contexts where nobody's watching you, where nobody can see what underwear you're wearing. So spillovers like that are kind of common with the way learning works, because it gets kind of just naturally embedded into your belief system. Maybe one third point that might be relevant. Oh,
well, I was going to say like tipping.
A third point that might be relevant.
Like tipping, if you're out with your friends and you tip big and they can see that, that's obvious why you're doing it. It's a social signal. But what if you're by yourself and maybe you're traveling and you're in some restaurant, you'll never be in that restaurant again. So the argument would be that I'm going to tip anyway because this kind of reinforces my own belief that I am a good person, I'm a generous person, I'm an altruistic person. And if I believe it, then that kind of carries over throughout my life.
Yeah, I think that it can do that, and it could therefore make you more persuasive as somebody who, is not just doing it for the reputational benefits, who is genuinely a kind or reciprocal person. I think it could definitely have that effect. And in general, I guess when people do good deeds without thinking consciously through the exact situational benefits, the exact reputational returns, those people are more trustworthy. And in fact, it didn't make it into this book, but there are some nice game theory models that kind of talk about principled behavior writ large. And, why do people have principles and kind of adhere to them regardless of the circumstances? And we think the best explanation for that is something like what you're saying, which is it just generally makes you more trustworthy. Other people will then trust that you'll abide by these principles, even in the circumstances where it might not be worth it or nobody can see what you're doing or you're in a foreign city.
Remember that Seinfeld episode where George pulls out a bill and he makes a big deal about putting it in the tip jar, but the guy behind the counter turns at the last second and he doesn't see it. So then George is like, oh no, then there was no point. So he reaches in to pull the bill out and then the guy turns around. It's funny because, of course, we shouldn't do that.
We agree. And I guess the reason why we laugh at George is he's kind of the stereotypical, like, not such a trustworthy person. And that behavior, it's somewhat altruistic. He's giving a tip, but it's somewhat puzzling why we look at someone who gives a tip just to get the applause and we say, well, that's not really a good person. And that kind of raises the question, well, if all we care about is whether you do good deeds, why do we care about whether you're, making sure that I'm watching you while you do it? But people do care about that. And so that's, I think, an important puzzle, why we care about the thought process and not just the action. And I guess the explanation we would give to that, which I think maybe you're already intuiting or alluded to earlier, is like, George is not going to tip you when he doesn't care about what you think or when you're not watching or when you're in a foreign city. He's really only going to do it in this very unique set of circumstances where it serves his interest. And that's going to make me, infer less from this context to like how he's going to treat me if I'm his romantic partner or his friend. I'm going to think, well, George is going to be thinking things through a little bit too much, and that's going to make him a little bit less reliable as a friend or a partner.
Well, and you had another example from Larry David's show in which he didn't he make a donation for a large building, but he should have done it anonymously because later the anonymous donor got the applause anyway, and then he's like, damn, I should have done it anonymously.
Yeah, if I had known that I had the option to give anonymously and then tell everybody, I would have taken it. Right. That's what he says. And
that's funny because it's violating that norm. Yeah. So let's see how far we can go with this. In another debate I did with Dinesh DSouza about the, without God, does anything go? Is there any...
I'm sorry.
Yeah, he's quite an interesting character. I mean, he wears his conservative Christian beliefs right on his sleeve for sure, and now is pro-Trumpism. But here was his argument that you guys, you atheists, you don't have some outside Archimedean point to give morals and objective value. So the reason you jump into the lake to save the drowning child is just because for some utilitarian calculus. And you get the rewards or any of the stuff we've just been talking about. To him, that's not real morality. But to me, if I genuinely believe and care about somebody else, even if it's a deception, self-deception, if I feel it and believe it, I'm more likely to signal to you that I'm a genuinely trustworthy and moral person. And therefore, I help somebody because I really want to help them. And I feel good about it. And they feel good about it. To me, that's as objective as it gets. I mean, it's genuine morality. I really do care. I'm not just pretending. Of course, there are the 1% to 3% psychopaths who do just fake it. But most of us, most of the time, really believe it. Isn't that good enough? Isn't that true morality?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of silly. Religion is good at getting people to internalize certain values, to internalize a certain sense of right and wrong, and to really believe it. But it's not the only way people internalize that, and people can have all sorts of non-religious forces that cause them to do that as well. And it obviously happens. I mean, if you've ever met a vegan or somebody who really cares about the environment, they genuinely care about this in exactly that way. And I don't know why religion has this special ability in his mind to do that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I do think religion does often have this effect that it makes people trustworthy as cooperators in this kind of principled way. But yeah, I agree with Erez. We've seen many other forces. Your emotional system, like empathy and compassion, like those can be deeply embedded and also make you reciprocate in a principled way. And ideologies of all sorts can do this. Nationalism can make people sacrifice for their country. You didn't need to be a theist to be willing to fight hard in World War II. Religion is one mechanism that can get people to be principled. And obviously, maybe I don't need to say this, many people can spout religions and not actually be deep believers, or they could make their religions to selfish interests.
But we're not talking about Dinesh right now.
Yeah. So
it can be
like there's this
fungible.
research shows that religious people donate more blood, they spend more time at charities, and they give more and donate more and so forth. So, but when you drill down, it's because they're part of a community that reinforces those. Like back to the Mormons, I mean, their tithing is actually very organized. You will be giving 10% of what you earn to the church. That's just the way it goes, including capital gains on property sales and things like that. I mean, they really have it professionalized. And so it's not so much that they genuinely believe that, they want to give. It's just that it's reinforced. And so if you're there in the pews on Sunday morning and the preacher says, hey, look, we got this problem. So-and-so's got cancer and they can't meet their medical bills. Let's all give in. Let's all chip in. Of course I'm going to do that. Whereas if I wasn't there, maybe I don't even know about the problem, or I'm not getting the reinforcement to do it. So it serves that purpose as well.
Yeah, you've got thousands of years of culturally evolved institutions that are very good at getting people to do these things, and they also get people to internalize them. And now we're, gradually developing alternatives that are secular, and those will get good at this as well.
I wanted to ask you about back to the war norms. I'm glad there's a norm against nuclear weapons. Let's hope that holds in the ensuing months here. And chemical weapons. But what difference does it make to me as a victim whether I get shot by a bullet or gassed or radiated? I mean, it's still, you see these tanks rolling into Kiev and blowing open these buildings and people lying on the ground shot in the back of their head. Why is there not a norm against tanks and bullets, whereas there is with chemicals and nuclear?
I mean, I think you're right. From a the victim's perspective, these things can often be more painful. So we give this example in the book about Iwo Jima from World War II, where this island was evacuated of civilians. It was only Japanese soldiers left on the island. And the American government had to decide, how to take over this island. And there was this question of, should we just drop chemical weapons from the air? And that would have killed off the Japanese soldiers without any risk to American life.
To be clear, this wasn't a theoretical question. Roosevelt's generals actually brought him this proposal, and he vetoed it.
Right. And instead of dropping the chemical weapons, what he used is primarily flamethrowers.
And grenades.
Right. So American soldiers are, on the ground. And obviously, that's much more dangerous for the American soldiers. Something like 30,000 American soldiers died taking over this island. So clearly much more costly to implement. It didn't save any more civilian lives. Again, there were none there. And then dying by flamethrower is, arguably no less painful than dying by chemical weapon. I mean, it's not a great way to die. And so from the victim's perspective, like you're saying, it's not obvious why we're so keen on maintaining this norm against chemical weapons. But what we would argue is, well, that's a norm that is sustainable, and let's sustain all the ones that we can. It's better to have that norm than no restrictions on norms of warfare. Right? Fewer people died because we didn't have that because we had that norm, or the norm against nuclear weapons. And as soon it would be nice if we could have even stronger norms, but it's very hard to enforce norms, and norms that just say minimize the amount of death. That's extremely hard to enforce. Especially because people have their own private incentives to be aggressive and to kill, and it's very hard to get them, to incentivize them to never do that. But luckily, for the past 70 years or so, we've been able to institute a new norm that we didn't have since World War II, a norm against aggressive warfare, and for the most part, that's held. And what we're seeing now in Ukraine is a threat to that norm, and I think that's that norm is really worth maintaining. And it's great that the international community has been imposing sanctions to try and maintain that norm. Because if that norm falls, you're back to the situation like we had before World War II, where, a country gets hungry for more resources and they just invade. And, it's good to show that there's a big cost in doing that. And, it'd be nice to have a norm against any kind of warfare. But that one at least is something that seems sustainable, like the norm against nukes and chemical weapons, and let's hope they all.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I mean, even Hitler did.
Have you heard
Hitler didn't use chemical weapons in World War II, and yet he clearly had no qualms about gassing Jews. So it's not that there was something wrong with the weapon; it was just because the norms of what you use on the battlefield. How do you get to this? Is a game theory problem. How do we get to nuclear zero? And here I don't have the solution because I'm not sure anybody does. That is to say, this is what you guys call the other guy problem, right? The security dilemma. I would get rid of my weapons if he would, but I don't trust him. And I better have just one, just in case. And then so he's got to have two just in case. So I got to have three just in case. And before you know it, we have 10,000 each or whatever we have. And, so I'm not sure how to solve that in the current situation of nation states in which there's never going to be 100% trust. So there's always going to be an incentive to have at least one just in case because of that other guy.
Yeah. I do think it would be hard to get down to zero. Unfortunately, the world would be much safer without any. But I think some things that can and that have made the world safe, even in the presence of nukes, is to have, external monitoring agencies that check that the nukes are being properly maintained, to have strong norms and expectations about what happens if you do use a nuclear weapon. It should be expected that you will get punished enough to deter you. And that these are treated as categorically different. So for instance, we do think that it's quite a threat if we start to have these nukes that are very small and only do a tiny bit of damage. These strategic nuclear weapons that bunker busting bombs, like these kind of things are actually quite threatening because they can destabilize the norm against nukes. As soon as you have this, I'm just doing it a little bit. The problem is like you can have a slippery slope from there. And something nice about categorical distinctions is they kind of prevent that slippery slope. And when norms are enforced, through coordination, like in international law, it's good to have these very, very well-defined categorical distinctions. So that is one threat to this norm is if you have like things that are kind of halfway nuclear bombs. That's a problem.
Right. Well, tactical nuclear weapons, right? That could happen.
Yeah, tactical. That's the word I was looking
so
for.
if Putin uses those, let's say in the Donbass region when he wants to grab those two and then declare victory, would we respond would it be a Nash equilibrium if we responded in kind with tactical nuclear weapons, or would we be better off just not responding in kind so that norm just goes back to what it was?
I think what the game theory here can help us non-experts do is understand the costs and the benefits. The benefit is that we might be maintaining the norm against using nuclear weapons. The costs are that we might escalate into a situation that's actually an outright war. And I think you'd need the experts to decide which costs and how big those costs and benefits are and which one to put more weight on. But I think that what we can do is at least understand by going ahead and responding, we will be saying we are going to uphold this norm, and the game theory can help us understand that that's what it's doing. And of course, everybody understands that by doing that, there's a risk of escalation.
The fact that this is a tough decision, I think, is part of what's scary about that situation. Is Putin might be tempted to use these tactical nukes because of the fact that he's not sure it will lead to escalation. And that temptation in itself can be what causes this norm against nukes to slowly break down. And to me, that's what's really scary about the current situation.
Well, that's what Obama said in 2014 after Putin annexed Crimea. What did you want me to do? Send in American troops because everybody's tired of that? Use our nuclear weapons? I mean, there's just not only so much you could do other than just keep reinforcing the norms that you can't annex new countries. And it rarely happens. It happens so rarely that it's a pretty big deal, right? Whereas before, let's say World War I, or maybe before World War II, if you look at the kind of the maps of Poland, just going back decade after decade, back, say, 2 centuries, it just changes constantly. And yet, after World War II, it was like, okay, that's it. No more of this revanchism. We're going to hold the borders where they are. That's it. Nobody gets to take any new territory. Well, that hasn't been perfect, but it's way better than it used to be.
So it seems like the norm does work. Our standard can't be 100% because that's never going to happen. But that something like that, it's worth fighting for, even if it's not perfect.
Yeah, we think that that's right. I guess it seems like the current strategy of handling this issue is to impose a cost, but do so in a way that's kind of indirect and doesn't itself risk escalation, like sanctions or like indirect warfare, where we supply aid to Ukraine.
Information, CIA's helping out, presumably, things like that.
And it's kind of, once Erez has spelled out kind of the costs and benefits as he did before, the same thing can be said with Crimea or invading Ukraine. The cost is escalation to full on, world war or nuclear war. We definitely, that's a huge cost. The benefit is maintaining this norm against aggressive warfare. And it seems like the way to have your cake and eat it too is to impose sanctions or indirect aid that don't risk escalation, at least to the same extent, but at the same time impose a cost on Putin for his activity, hopefully enough of a cost that it acts as a deterrent to either Putin in the future or future, warmongers.
Yeah, it's good to remember that having the norms or the laws don't have to be perfect. Just because there's still murders doesn't mean we shouldn't have laws against murder. We should. It's just never going to be perfect. And so the idea is just reduce the carnage or the destructiveness. So outcasting through economic sanctions works pretty well. It's better than armed conflict in the long run, but it's never going to be perfect. And so we should continue doing that. But here's a weird situation, considering what we've gone through now. Let's say Putin withdraws, declares victory after he takes the eastern province there. And then a year from now, he shows up at the G20 meeting, and what? Biden's supposed to walk up and shake his hand and let's go back to some trade agreements and keep things going because that's better than armed conflict. I just have a hard time picturing anybody, dealing with Putin again after this.
So what we would argue is there's kind of two effects of sanctions, and it's maybe worth keeping them distinct in our minds. One effect is you want to reduce Putin's ability to wage war right now. So we want to reduce his coffers. We want to increase Ukraine's chance of being able to fend him off. And that's crucial, but that's, I don't think, the only benefit of isolating Putin and sanctioning Putin. The other benefit is to make it very clear that anybody who violates this norm will pay a heavy cost, a cost bigger than they could expect to gain. And that requires maintaining that punishment even after the war is over, or even if it can't affect the current war. And so for that reason, I think it is crucial that we don't just say, okay, now that Ukraine's, dealt with, you can come back and trade with us and, have normal relations. We need to make sure that the penalty is high enough, even if it doesn't change the facts on the ground in Ukraine, that it deters Putin from invading another country or, another warmonger from imitating Putin.
Yeah. Yeah, another one of my favorite books on this, Christopher Boehm's Moral Origins book, where he has that database of hunter-gatherer communities and how they deal with bullies and free riders and just people that don't play nice by the rules. And so they deal with them, through a series of measures, from gossiping to punishment and strict rules against them, all the way to capital punishment, where if the guy is just really a bully, they just take him out on a hunt and come back without him. And the fact that all of the men, in this case, participating in the murder, the capital punishment of the guy, also kind of diffuses the responsibility for it, so there's no revenge against any one person for this. But the question was always, why can't... Okay, so he's arguing that we this is sort of an evolved mechanism of dealing with people that don't play by the norms. But why didn't it get to zero? Why didn't natural selection eliminate every last bully, and there just are no more psychopaths, sociopaths in our genome, whereas we still have 1% to 3%. Maybe the cost is too high.
Yeah, no,
maybe the cost is too high to get rid of all of them. And so you have to. So we tolerate a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think human nature is hard to tame. We do have selfish interests, and it requires coordination. It requires checks and balances. It requires a lot of work to tame these motives, and we do a lot of it. But sometimes people end up with a lot of strength and power, and sometimes they have their own perverse incentives that's really hard to get around. And, with Putin right now, part of the problem is, for instance, that Germany depends on Putin for energy. And that's going to make it harder for the international community to tame Putin. And, that dynamic, is common. Sometimes somebody gets a little bit too powerful to hold them down. Trump, for instance, has control over the Republican coalition right now, and they're deathly afraid of him primarying them or losing their ability to win future elections. And that gives him a hold on power that makes it harder for, what would have been the norms of American politics to keep him down. And so, oftentimes people are clever, and, consciously or not, people like Putin and Trump are good at finding the weaknesses in the system and figuring out, if Germany's energy dependent on me, or if the Republican Party, I can primary, like that reduces the ability for them to hold me down. And human beings are very good at finding these loopholes or these flaws in the system.
Yeah, I think that explains the bizarre behavior of people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Josh Hawley and a few of the other hardcore Trump followers. I mean, they just say the stupidest, craziest, most irrational things. But they know the boss is listening, right? And if they don't appease the boss, then they're going to get primaried, or they're not going to have his support. And so that goes a long way to explaining irrationality, some of it, like QAnon. How can anybody possibly believe QAnon? And yet some significant two-digit number percentage of Republicans say they think there could be something to this claim that Hillary Clinton and other Democratic leaders have been running a child pedophile ring out of a pizzeria. I mean, it's so dumb. It's embarrassing to even say it, what QAnon is, that anyone would believe it. But in a way, I think using your theory would be that it's a costly signaling, right? It's like, I am so loyal to my party, I'm willing to publicly endorse this completely crazy idea. And the crazier it is, the more it signals my loyalty.
I do think some of that signaling of craziness or of loyalty is going on. Maybe one thing that I would add is, and this I think is often the case with these kind of conspiratorial beliefs, is they often actually are benefiting a certain subset of the coalition or leadership in the coalition. And I'll highlight what that benefit might be. And that leader or subset then reinforces those who maintain the belief. So, with the big lie of 2020 about, that the election was rigged, that clearly, allows Trump to claim he's not a loser. It also allows him to mess with the next election, have a justification for, say, letting Republican governors choose their electors in 2024, for letting them suppress the vote a little bit more among the electorate that they don't want. So it offers justification that in that case serves Trump and maybe also other Republicans who are afraid that they can't win a free and fair election. And so they then, of course, have a motive to push this lie on others. And I guess I know less about the details of QAnon, but I presume many of the QAnon conspiracies have a similar flavor, that they help justify maintaining certain power structures or opposing.
The point is that this crazy set of beliefs is not crazy in a random way. It seems crazy in a way that one can understand when you understand the incentives on the ground.
Another example of this that we like to give is the big debate in the Protestant Reformation about the Eucharist. So, it seems crazy that people are willing to die for this claim that's like in no way testable or has any practical implications about whether this wafer either is God or represents God. Like, either way you eat it, either way it's not going to give you botulism or whatever the way meat would, so it seems like almost a semantic debate. And yet theologians have, spent their lives devoted to this question, and wars have been fought over it. And that seems kind of arbitrary, but like with the big lie, we don't think it is, because, if you think about it, whether the wafer gets turned into God by a priest or just merely represents God, well, that dictates whether or not you need to give due deference to the priests and the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, which was crucial for maintaining the Catholic Church's hold on power. And so clearly the Catholic Church, it's not arbitrary that they gave this wafer this interpretation, and the Protestant Church, which wanted to remove the power from the Catholic Church, took a very different stance.
And from the priests in particular, right?
Say it again.
And they wanted to remove the power for the priests.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So again, it's not, it's a bit weird that individual people care so much about this question, but not so much if you think about the power that their church leaders had over them. So if you live in a Protestant state and you try to have Catholic beliefs, you could end up being burnt at the stake, or vice versa. If you live in a Catholic state and you have it's no coincidence that you end up individual people take such a strong stance on this and are willing to die for it because, well, there's a lot of pressures being held on them. But then the stance that they end up having aren't arbitrary. They're very much what affect the power of the people who have power over them.
Yeah. Right. Otherwise, some of these religious claims sound completely absurd. Like if I had spaghetti bolognese and I said, well, this represents the body and blood of Christ, you would correctly surmise I'd lost my mind. But in the context of a religion and everything you just put it into, okay, there's a kind of rationality, say a hidden rationality behind human behavior that makes sense in that context. So another debate I'm interested in is to what extent humans are naturally rational or irrational. After reading your book, it seems like a lot of apparent irrationalities actually are rational in the context of game theory.
Yeah. So we would distinguish between rational in the sense that like the beliefs correspond to the truth. Like there's no sense in which this wafer is truly, the flesh of God. But it might still be rational in the sense that those beliefs are the smart thing to do given your incentive structure. That if you're going to be burnt at the stake for not holding that belief, well, it's pretty rational in that sense to hold this belief. Not rational in the sense that it gives you a correct, accurate view of the world, but rational in the sense that it'll prevent you from getting punished quite heavily.
Joe Henrich has this great example. He goes to Fiji and he discovers that the Fijian women, as they are pregnant or are breastfeeding, avoid certain foods. There are certain food taboos. He digs around a bit and he discovers that this is because the particular sets of food they avoid have a toxin in them that can damage the fetus and the newborn. And so he concludes, I think he puts together a very nice argument in favor of this, that these food taboos are driven by the avoidance of this toxin. But he also bothers to ask people, hey, why do you avoid this? What's the story? And they're like, oh, if you eat eel, it makes it so that your kid's elbows become scaly, or your kid will smell funny. And there's a sense in which that's irrational, but there's a sense in which it's very rational. And so another example.
Irrational in that you end up with a fallacious view of how the world works. That's not how fetuses actually develop. But rational in the sense that you do end up with a functional behavior. That your beliefs do end up leading you to having kids.
Healthier babies.
That are healthier. Because you're avoiding this toxic foods.
It's kind of a pragmatic truth. It's not a corresponds to reality truth, but it's a truth in the sense that it actually affects the outcome of human lives, reproductive success. And so from a Darwinian perspective, it's true because it works. It leads to a higher reproductive rate for the organisms that employ it.
That's right.
Yeah, interesting.
And I guess our claim is that cultural evolution can lead to these pragmatic truths just because, if you hold this belief, okay, you'll have an inaccurate view of the world, but you'll at least end up with healthy babies. So that'll select for these inaccurate beliefs. And, so that's one notion of pragmatic truths. And another notion that we mentioned before is sometimes you have inaccurate beliefs because of the way the social incentive structure works. You don't want to get burnt at the stake, or you want to persuade other people, like the Trivers von Hippel story that we talked about before.
Well, and like witch crazes, how they spread. At around the time that science was coming online as a strong institution of determining what's true, given that women really can't fly on brooms or do all the things that that people believed, I wonder if there's a kind of certain game theoretic logic to my going along with agreeing that that woman over there cavorted with Satan in the middle of the night, and that explains why my crops failed, or the so-and-so's cow died, or there was this plague or this disaster. And it has kind of, again, back to this pragmatic logic or pragmatic truth to it.
Yeah. Well, I guess I do want to say sometimes we get fallacious beliefs for other reasons, like it's just really hard to develop a good model of how the world works. And, with the help of modern science, we can do a decent job at that. But, humans have very limited information. And so sometimes we might be really striving to get at the truth, and we get false beliefs just because it's a hard problem. And, understanding, physics and aerodynamics and, how, agency works, it's possible we just get that wrong sometimes. And that presumably explains some of our bad beliefs, our fallacious beliefs. But, with witchcraft, maybe part of it is that. But I think there could be a pragmatic element to it too, like we were discussing. And that might be, for instance, that, women who are widowers and elderly might end up becoming dependent on the society for care. And especially if they're poor and can't care for themselves or don't have living family members, it might help to have an excuse to off them. Or if they're, violating the norms and, doing some sketchy things, okay, you can accuse them of witchcraft and, get rid of someone that way, or an enemy. If they're vying for power with you, you can use kind of your social network to take them down. And one way to do that is to accuse them of witchcraft. And I think there is good evidence that a lot of witchcraft accusations have this flavor, especially from minority populations that can't defend themselves. I guess you see something analogous with Jews who are victims of, these conspiracies
Pogroms.
about them. Say it again?
The pogroms.
Yeah, in many of the pogroms, they were they were justified by things like, oh, they're poisoning the wells. And like, there's no evidence that they were poisoning the wells, but if they're a minority with, not that much protection and some wealth, you can use this as an excuse to coordinate on attacking them. And, in a time of need, it's good to have a scapegoat, especially one that can't protect themselves, and you can extract their resources, you can get rid of competition that way. And, witches and pogroms, unfortunately, this is one thing that you often see with human nature, and it could be justified with the belief system, but yes, the belief system might be serving a pragmatic purpose, albeit an evil one, but a pragmatic
Also, on
purpose.
top of all that...
There is some evidence...
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, on top of all that, there's
some
the
evidence
kind
on
of... Sorry, we have a kind of a gap in our connection. Sorry. I was just going to say that there's also preemptive denunciation. That is to say, if I denounce so-and-so as a witch, then I'm less likely to get denounced as a witch. We saw this in the communist show trials. I need to accuse my neighbors of being bad citizens before I get accused of that. And that my accusation is a signal to everybody else, I'm so loyal, I'm going to finger other people.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead. You were going to say something.
In any given...
I was just going to say there's actually evidence that I know that it exists for witchcraft. I'm not so familiar with it there, but for Jews, there's evidence that these beliefs around Jews poisoning wells and violence were related to external factors that one can trace to incentives. So this kind of goes back to our previous discussion about incentives shaping beliefs around, in this case, around outgroup
So when
members.
there was more of a time of need, for instance, Jews were more at risk of being targeted.
It's actually a pretty simple story. It looks like the local ruler would use the Jews as these middlemen, and they were great at collecting taxes within the community, and so they were happy to have them around. They were also somewhat wealthier than the surrounding peasant population. Most of the time, the ruler would protect them, and every once in a while, things would get really bad, and the peasants would be pretty hungry, and he would just lift those protections.
Well, all right, let's talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Let's say after the Ukraine problem is solved, you get a call from President Biden's office and says, all right, you guys have the game theoretic model here. How can we apply this? Let's once and for all solve the Middle East problem. And it seems to me that this is going to touch on some deeper issues. For example, one way I characterize it is you have two guys with each of which has a deed to the same piece of land, and there's no like title company you can go to and go, all right, let's track the paper record to see who actually owns this house, and then we'll know who actually owns the house, because the title company is God, and God said this land is yours, and each of them has that claim. How do you resolve that? So let's just talk about that for a minute. Why is this problem so intractable, and where can we make any progress?
Well, I do think, like you're saying, there is a real scarce resource here. It is a small plot of land that two peoples want, and that by its nature is going to create a bargaining problem of sorts, and bargaining problems of sorts inevitably have inefficiencies built into them, waste built into them, which, people, each side wants to kind of signal their commitment to like taking a tough stance, and that's going to lead to the inability to reach kind of what economists might call the Pareto frontier, the most efficient solution that doesn't involve fighting or lack of agreement. And so it's no surprise that it's very hard to prevent aggression and warfare and loss in a situation like this. There's some beautiful theorems in game theory. Meyerson Satterthwaite is the famous reference that says in bargaining problems you have inefficiency, and many people use this to explain why you have warfare in general. But I think it particularly applies here. It is a real problem, and it gets justified in religious terms. People do end up having beliefs like God gave this to me, or nationalistic terms. Like it's European colonists or Zionist invaders, and there's often stories and justifications, but I think at the crux of the matter, there is a piece of land that two people want, and that's a tough problem. And the other thing that makes it tough is this idea of, in order to deter transgressions, in order to prevent another side from taking advantage of you and attacking you, you need to fight back when they do. Otherwise, you have the situation like you had with Hitler and Chamberlain. In the lead up to World War II, you kind of need to show that you're not going to be taken advantage of.
I'll add a third problem, which is that often the leaders, while they're paying lip service to solving the problem, may have an incentive to not solve it. They may be staying in power precisely because of the fact that the problem exists.
So like what we saw with Vietnam and arguably with Iraq, we know that leaders have a good chance of being reelected in the time of war. And that creates this perverse incentive to not end wars and admit defeat, and also sometimes to start wars. The leaders might have a different interest than the populace, who has to pay a lot more of the cost of war. And that could lead to some stupid wars being started, or some solutions to wars being avoided or derailed. And obviously that's a bit of a cynical view, and we don't think that that's the whole problem, but that could be playing a role in exacerbating the problem, this kind of principal agent.
So to answer your question, we hope nobody asks us.
That's funny. Yeah, right, because no one has a solution to that. Yeah, it seems to me this is a sacred value problem. Like, so if the Biden administration said, hey, look, I got my checkbook, just give us the price. What's the price? What's the value of Jerusalem? We'll just write you a check. The correct answer is you can't put a price on it. There's no price for this. I was thinking about this reading your section on Alan Fiske's four characteristics of relationships: communal sharing, authority ranking, equality matching, and market pricing. So let's go through those. I'm going to have you go through those in a second, but that last one, market pricing, I was watching that movie Indecent Proposal the other night, where Demi Moore and Woody Harrelson are offered $1 million by the Robert Redford character if he can sleep with her for one night. And of course, it plays out showing how this violates these norms. Like, there's no price you can put on sex. It's a kind of a sacred value that, and this touches the issues why, like, prostitution is almost always illegal, even though why should it be? If consenting adults want to do whatever they want to do, it's none of my business. But that feels different. Same thing with organ, where you could sell your organs, sell one of your kidneys. This always meets with great resistance, even though there's great plans to how to implement this without it, being just the realm of rich people and so on. And yet there's still that sense like you can't put a price on an organ, you can't put a price on sex, you can't put a price on sacred land. So go through those four relationships and how that kind of alters the game theoretic models.
Yeah. Well, economists often talk as if everything is a market interaction, and you can, it's just cost-benefit ratios, and there's always trade-offs, and, you should just find the utilitarian efficient solution.
And this is why nobody likes economists.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Or utilitarians, for that matter. They also get some beef. But I think it does raise an interesting puzzle, which is, why isn't that the way humans analyze things? And we don't. Like, intuitively, we have this notion of sacred values, and we find it a little bit gross and perverse to put a price on certain things. And there's another question of, when do we put prices on things? When do we refuse to put prices on things? Which kind of things do we treat as sacred? And so I guess the way to tie it into the Israeli-Palestinian issue, I think maybe one of two things might be at play there. One is, I might want to signal to the people who are voting for me or follow me as a leader or who trust me as an authority figure, I might want to signal, like, I'm really trustworthy. I'm not going to just, sell out Israel for my own private gain. I'm not willing to make those calculations. And by treating Israel or the land or in a sacred way, it might make me more trustworthy as a leader. The other way in which it might make me more trustworthy to treat this as sacred is in a bargaining situation. If I'm bargaining with you, I want you to trust that I won't give in, that I'm fully committed. That, like, this is my stance, take it or leave it. In general,
he hasn't told me this one before. It's good.
In general, in bargaining, it's good to be able to take that kind of strong stand, because, if I'm not going to give in at all, I can go right up to, like, your willingness to accept, right up to, like, your alternative option. And if you know that I'm fully committed, you'll say, okay, fine, I'll take it. And then I could get most of the pie that way. And so if the Israeli leadership, can convince the other side or vice versa that, like, they're willing to they would never take a penny less. They would never give up any amount of land. They're not willing to consider trade-offs. Then, that's a pretty tough bargaining position. It's just unfortunately bad if we both commit to that. And so, that brings, I'm sure you've heard this example from Thomas Schelling. He talks about the best way to win, I guess, these old, teenagers who would drive cars towards each other. And the first one, the game of chicken, the first one to go off the road loses, right? Okay, so the best way to win that game, according to Thomas Schelling, is you stick a pole in your steering wheel that, like, prevents you from being able to swerve, okay? Especially if the other side can see that you did that. That commitment allows you to win this battle. Yeah. The problem is, if they don't see it, or they don't believe that you're fully committed, or they do it at the same time. Okay, doing it at the same time is, so all of those can lead to, a big conflict. And I guess that might be what we see in Israel-Palestine. We're not sure how committed both sides are, but if they, to the extent that they are committed, that this idea that it's sacred and you have this religious justifications, that could perpetuate the conflict and make it a lot more costly. But might still have had a strategic benefit to begin with.
Yeah, some of those other violations of those relational models, like Woody Allen had this funny bit about how he said, my grandfather on his deathbed sold me his watch. Like, what? Or, if you go to a restaurant and you order a nice meal and then you say, well, I don't have any money, but I'll have the owner over to my house for dinner. It's like, no. Or you have friends over for dinner to your house, and they all take out their checkbook or give you a credit card for it. None of that makes sense because, we just think, like in a marriage, for example, we don't keep track of who eats what food or how much of the milk you drank or anything like that. Whereas roommates might kind of keep track of that sort of thing. So those are the kinds of things that tilt these game models and kind of jigger with the utilitarian calculus, because some things just can't be calculated.
Mm-hmm. So one thing that we would argue is, particularly with, like, long-term relationships, like a marriage or a strong friendship, you really don't want to be with someone who's so calculated about these things. And so, yes, tit for tat, reciprocal altruism, that's a good thing. It's good if people are reciprocating. But if they're calculating, to the T and keeping tabs, that tells you, like, okay, maybe if they have a really good opportunity to cheat, they'll take it. Maybe if I give them access to my bank account and there's a few $1 million in there, then I'm at risk. And so if you really need to trust someone and you really need to rely on someone, and the circumstances might vary over time, there might be more temptations in the future, those are the cases where you really want someone who's not calculating. And for a lot of these kind of relationships, like a marriage, that's crucial. You really want to know that they're going to be there through thick and thin. And so therefore it's really important that they're not thinking through consciously, the pros and cons and keeping tabs on everything.
So there's a deeper signal there, right? That I love you so much.
That's right.
There is no price
that I would put on the value of our marriage, other than, I will never, violate our rules with each other, our promises, and so on. I remember I had a neighbor, Jim and Val. They had a rocky marriage, and then I knew it was over when I saw her driving her husband's car, and she told me. I asked her about that, and she goes, "Oh, he sold it to me, and he gave me a really crappy price for the car." I went, "Oh, okay, this marriage is not going to last, right?" And yet we still do little things to kind of reinforce the point, right? I mean, if my wife says "I love you" this morning, and I usually respond "I love you too," but if I didn't respond, or if I said something like "Oh, thank you," or "Oh, that's nice," she'd be like, "And." So there is kind of an expectation. It's not formal. There's no price on it. There's no rules. It's just kind of understood. It reminds me of that Tim Minchin joke about what you call, let's see, what do you call love without evidence? And his answer is stalking. Right. I mean, there are little cues that we get back and forth in any relationship. Like, I want this to go further, or I don't, or in a marriage, we kind of reinforce our vows and our love for each other every day. Little notes, just little things that couples do. It's not written down. There's no formal rules that could ever explain it. It's just kind of understood, right? Unconsciously, if you love somebody, you reinforce this regularly. And a marriage there's a sign that marriages are going downhill when that stops, right? So like in marriage counseling, when one person in a couple rolls their eyes or shows disgust for their partner, that's like a 95% chance that marriage is going to break up. So there are those there is kind of a unconscious, or I don't know, sub-level of norms that goes on.
So I do think there's a difference between being calculating and keeping tabs and being very strategic and Machiavellian, which makes you less trustworthy. And we think that our notion of being principled and being in love kind of is about signaling trust and making, that's being contrasted with being super calculating. But that I think is slightly different from what you're talking about now, which is more just in relationships, you still need to convey information. You still need to develop norms between you guys and a way to interact. And symbolic gestures are going to be crucial for that. And open communication is going to be crucial for that. And it is important to be attentive to that kind of stuff. And, that raises its own set of puzzles, which is why do we attend so much to these symbolic gestures? How do we convey all these cues in such subtle ways and pick up on them? And those are all interesting problems as well. I don't know if you wanted to jump in earlier. And
No, but to tie it back to the point that you made earlier about relationship bins, you could you could kind of think of this puzzle around symbolic gestures, just like why we want that "I love you" back, as fitting in with that question that you raised before, basically saying, hey, are we in the same relationship bin? Are we still in this loving, caring, romantic relationship together or not? And if you don't say "I love you," I might start to suspect I'm in it, but you're not, which is a bad place to be.
So symbolic gestures, like saying "I love you," are crucial for coordinating on what kind of relationship we have. Are we in a relationship where we're monogamous? Or are we in a relationship where we're invested? Are we in the relationship where we're principled about caring about each other, or where we're calculating and it's a market or reciprocal interaction? Symbolic gestures really are crucial for coordinating on what kind of relationship we have.
Yeah. All right, gentlemen, we've been going almost an hour and a half here, plus our other segment that's going to push us closer to 2 hours. But I don't want to let you go without talking about justice, because this is one of the most important issues we have today. Like back to the Alan Fiske relationship models. One is this kind of authority ranking. Part of the kind of Me Too movement has been that a lot of that was violated. That is, professors are not supposed to sleep with students, and the boss should not sleep with one of the employees, and power differentials in which you have these kind of norm violations there has led to the Me Too movement kind of exposing that a lot of people still didn't get what the new rules should be. And so let's talk about that. To what extent we have a sense of justice evolved in our genome, let's say, and we want what's fair, and how difficult it's been to get to the point where we are now over the centuries.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I guess one thing I would say is our notion of fairness and justice and morality is clearly something that's, we think of it as being largely shaped by social incentives. They're going to play a big role. And so things like norm enforcement are going to matter a lot. And hence things like, because norms matter a lot and these kind of social incentives, that can lead to big changes over time. And one change that we might be seeing is this shift around like the norms about what kind of sexual relationships are or are not socially acceptable. And those norms are going to benefit some people and harm others. Different people may do better in these different regimes with these different norms, and they might fight back against it. They might be under threat against it. So I think that's one key thing that's at play is with the Me Too movement, it shifts power from some people to other people. Other things that it does is it might be hard for people to figure out what the norm is, especially in times of change, and that could also be problematic if people aren't really sure how to behave or what this means. That could be hard for them, but. I guess in general, the norms used to be more favorable towards men or the people who would have been accused, and they're shifting more towards women or accusers, and they're shifting from bosses to employees, and those are going to have winners and losers, and there might be efficiency gains. It might in general be a better norm, but some people are gonna win and some people are gonna lose from it.
Yeah, I teach at Chapman University, so we all have to take these sensitivity training programs about race and gender and so forth. They're so lame, but I get the point that, well, first legally, they can always say, look, we put that guy through the training program and he still violated our rules, so our hands are clean and you can't sue us or something like that. But I think more along the lines of what you're writing about, it's just reinforcing to everybody we have new norms, even though most of you get it. And you're not violating the norms, but just in case, everybody has to take these training programs. And I think we're probably going to go through something like that with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the police. Even though most police are not racist, and everybody's moral sphere has expanded and the moral arc has bent and so forth. But just in case, we want as many people to go through this training program. And not discriminate and so forth. I think part of that is that kind of overcoming that human nature to want to lord it over other people or just kind of selfishly do what you want.
Yeah, we talked earlier about the fact that norms are coordinated, and that's going to require something like saying a public statement that says we're going to shift from this to this. And you see some of these public statements by organizations like universities around Black Lives Matter and stuff like this that seem like they don't have that much content. We think that it's bad that police violence happened. Of course you do. Why are you saying that? But just saying that is starting to shift the norm around, okay, how are we going to behave as an institution, and the individuals inside the institution are going to behave, and we're going to need to announce that publicly, even if some of the time that seems purely symbolic.
Yeah, for sure. We just hired a diversity, equity, and inclusion dean. That's a lot of money. It's a big investment because he has an office, support staff, and so on. But you go to Chapman University or any university, these are amongst the most inclusive, non-judgmental, non-prejudicial, liberal, progressive people you will ever find anywhere. This seems like the last place we need to, lord it over people and say but what you're saying is that it's a public statement, or it's, we're spending money. We're putting our money where our mouth is, that we are very committed to these new values.
Yeah. It does do that. I think one or two other things that it might do is now there's a stakeholder. There's somebody whose interest is in maintaining that norm. So now that office, like the person on the pirate ship who's in charge of keeping people in line, now they have an incentive in ensuring, their whole job and their ability to get promoted or keep the job or get the next job depends on Chapman succeeding on this dimension. And having a stakeholder can really keep Chapman at the forefront of that issue. I think another thing that might be happening, I don't want to say too much about whether this is happening in that particular case, but oftentimes you see firms doing the cheapest symbolic gesture that doesn't require them to actually change their behavior. So it might be very hard to get an equal number of female math professors as male math professors. That could be very hard, but it's a lot easier to just throw some money at the problem, or have a statement on the website that says we're an equal opportunity employer. Now maybe it's doing other things like we discussed, but one thing it could be doing is it could be allowing us to present ourselves as caring about the issue without actually trying very hard to solve it. And I guess
Right.
you saw this a lot.
Virtue signaling.
Yeah, that's right. And you saw it a lot. I don't know. Different companies that, like Erez said, on the first day of Black History Month, post Black Lives Matter or something like this, but then go on to find Republicans who are not doing the best things on race issues. Oftentimes they might really care about having this Republican person in power because they're going to reduce taxes and deregulate their industry. And that's where the real money is. And putting up, a little tweet doesn't really cost them anything. And so oftentimes you see this where people, I guess, like you say, virtue signal. They're presenting themselves as an ally but behind the scenes are doing things that might be subverting the mission because it really benefits them a lot.
You have that great discussion of the Star Trek The Next Generation, one of my favorite series, of the episode on the Edo planet, where it's the death penalty for anybody that like, say, steps off the path and squashes some flowers. And, the rest of the episode is the hand-wringing over that. What's the purpose of the death penalty? I mean, before, let's say, 18th century England, I think there was something like 220 crimes for which the death penalty was imposed, including like insulting the Queen's garden, things like that. That's that idea that, we can keep law and order by having this incredibly strong punishment. And yet the trend over the centuries has been to abolish the death penalty and torture, by the way. I mean, the United States is one of the few Western countries that still has it on the books, and most states don't practice the death penalty anymore. And it's hard to get the chemicals for, the drugs for the lethal injections. I think only Texas, Ohio, and maybe Florida and Oklahoma, maybe. I think there's only 4 or 5 states that regularly impose the death penalty, actually practice it. It's so rare. That seems to be the trend. So what's the game theoretic logic behind punishment? And why have we gone so far to imprison so many people? I mean, the United States has, 2.5, 3 million prisoners now? So just talk about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, let me set aside the prisoner question for a moment and talk about this notion of cruel and unusual punishment, which we're more against now than we used to be. And I think, there's kind of pros and cons to having cruel and unusual punishment. A pro it seems kind of self-evident, although maybe there's still some debate about it, that if you can have really draconian punishment, that's gonna work well for deterrence. Of course, the con of that is it could be abused. So you could have somebody, just torture to get confessions of things that are made up, so that the king can steal their land or kill off their wife that they no longer want. And so you can abuse these powers, and that's a big risk of having them. And then another problem is, of course, it's pretty inefficient to have these really hefty punishments. A lot of people will get put to death or tortured who don't deserve it, or for very minor things like, for stealing bread when people are starving. Okay, you can kill all those people, that'll prevent them from stealing bread, but they're still going to starve, and maybe that's a good solution for you if you don't care about the people. But as democracy spreads and the people have more power, that's gonna weigh against the abuse of these leaders, and also make them weigh more heavily your own interests. And so I think that's a large part of why you got these kind of norms against cruel and unusual punishment, is because the people just got more power, and so that's one thing that's going on. But incarceration in the U.S., I think it's kind of a separate issue. And I don't know, does Erez want to say something about?
Yeah, I have a second idea, which is that in addition to the fact that the balance of power shifted, I think also our ability to enforce has shifted. So if it's the case that it's very hard to catch criminals, you might need much bigger crimes. Mm-hmm. As we get better at catching criminals, we might be able to deter crime with smaller punishments. Mm-hmm. And that requires that we shift, we coordinate that shift to smaller and smaller punishments over time, which I think is also happening.
Yeah.
Like a utilitarian calculus. So the major reforms came from Jeremy Bentham and Cesare Beccaria.
about making the punishment fit the crime. It's more of a rational approach to reducing the amount of crime, which makes sense. But of course, it's never going to be perfect. So you have a signal detection problem. We want to make sure that the people we imprison are the ones that are actually guilty. So my argument against the death penalty is that we're not very good at that. There's still too many people being imprisoned that are innocent. And if you take their life, then that's giving too much power to the state. And what the Innocence Project has exonerated something like over 300 people now that were actually innocent using DNA. And some percentage of those were on death row. So that seems like a pretty good argument against that. Even though intuitively it feels like if it was my family member my wife was brutally raped and murdered, would I want this person to suffer? Yeah, as much as possible. I remember that debate that Mike Dukakis did with, I think it was George H.W. Bush, right? In which they asked him, Mike Dukakis was against the death penalty. And they said, all right, what if your wife Kitty was raped and murdered? And then he rattled off some rational arguments about the death penalty. And the correct answer, and he got hammered for that, the correct answer is, I'd want to fry this motherfucker and pound him with my own fist. That's how I feel personally. But that's exactly why we can't have the death penalty, because we can't have a society based on people just acting based on their emotions and the desire for revenge.
I think that these arguments make sense. I guess maybe the only thing that I would add is it's probably not a coincidence that Jeremy Bentham was able to make these arguments, and the arguments were able to spread and change some of our social institutions at a time when the populace already had power and there were already kind of checks on the government. Democracy had been spreading. And as those things, that's going to change the power dynamics. That will also change which kind of arguments we find acceptable and what our notion of fairness and how we weigh, innocent civilians being harmed against, deterring bad actors. Those are going to be affected by the balance of power.
Yeah, are you familiar with
maybe
Richard Nisbet's research about the culture of honor in southern states versus northern, particularly New England states? And that's why rates of crime and murder, particularly homicide in the South, are higher, because people take justice into their own hands, self-help justice, as it's called. He did that. It's one of my favorite experiments where the word asshole was actually in the abstract or was actually in the title of the paper, or maybe it was the abstract, where he had subjects fill out a form and then walk down a hallway to turn it into some other office. And along the way, they encounter somebody that's doing something there. And this person bumps into them and says, asshole. And then he wanted to see what the response would be of the students. And some of the students were from New England states, some of them were from southern states. And the ones from southern states had measurably higher testosterone increase and stress hormones. And they were ready to take it outside and mix it up with this guy, where the students from the New England states were apologetic. Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to bump into you. It's all totally my fault. So his argument was that in the South, democracy came late. And also it was populated by people that, like these ranchers, that have these norms where you have to settle things yourself. You can't count on the government or the state to do it. So they have this culture of honor in which, requires a little more of a badass attitude, which then increases the probability of there being more homicides.
Yeah, there's a parallel to this in the culture of dueling. You find that when states are strong, you don't have dueling, and when states are weak, dueling will arise naturally, and has arisen naturally historically in a variety of different contexts, ranging from Japan to early medieval Europe. And the hypothesis there is that if you can count on the state to punish transgressions, then you don't need this. But if you need to punish transgressions yourself, you also need a check on being violent against somebody else when it's in your interest. And so the institution of dueling arises in order to enable that. And it seems in general that things that maintain peace through the threat of violence in these ways, like a culture of honor, like dueling, they can work. And it's amazing how much peace you can get. Of course, when things don't go well, then you get these crazy duels, or you get this crazy hot temper. But for the most part, they help to maintain peace. And we only really, as soon as the state gets strong enough, we can substitute away from them and spend less time in that hot-tempered place that's somewhat dangerous. And so there's this substitution between that more formal institution and this informal societal way of enforcing
Just to
peace.
give the argument, if you're in a place with a weak state, then you tend to develop these cultures of honor, especially when you have things that are easily taken from you, like your cattle, and so that's why cultural honors tend to show up in cattle economies more so. But the logic of it is, if you don't have a state to protect your property or your honor when other people transgress against you, if you don't get really upset and punish them even at a cost to yourself by risking a fight or something like that, well, then other people will learn, like we mentioned with Chamberlain and Hitler, other people will learn that they could take advantage of you. And so you kind of need to have this vengeance motive built in. And we just kind of tamper that when we know that it's less important. In my society, if somebody steals my property, I don't need to get super angry at them. If I could just call the cops. And other people might be deterred from taking my stuff anyways because they know that there's a chance that they'll get it, go to jail for it. And so we don't really need to rely on this vengeance in our society so much as you did in the Wild West.
Well, and this explains why the BLM movement does matter in a sense, because if you really believe the police are not going to protect you and don't have your best interests in mind, then that is in part what leads to these higher crime rates in inner cities, particularly where drugs are involved and the drug dealers are operating in a black market where there is no free market, and they can't go to the police to settle their disputes. They can't sue each other, can't go to the courts. Then you're going to get those kind of higher rates of violence.
Yeah. I guess I would also add that historically, and there's still some truth to it today, police have been used, and the legal system and incarceration rates have been used to maintain the power structure, including power that's very asymmetric. So between whites and blacks, or between rich people and poor people, and it is a very powerful means of the state to maintaining the hierarchy and the power structure. And, as we saw, with white collar crime in 2008 or the Trump administration, the police and incarceration is less likely to get involved in those cases than with the crime that very poor people commit or minorities commit. And so it is being used asymmetrically. And I guess, it does have the ability to be exploited and abused like that to maintain the power structure, and where the costs get borne a lot by people at the bottom tier of the hierarchy.
All right, gentlemen, that's a good place to stop. I think we've hit most of the big issues. I do hope the Biden administration does call you to solve some of these problems, because I think game theory really is the best way to go. Again, remembering that there's no utopia to be found. It's just trade-offs to find provisional solutions. That's the best we can do, but it's pretty good. There's a rational set of arguments behind it. And I think your book has presented that. Again, Hidden Games. We will we'll provide the link in the show notes. And I just want to thank you guys for your work and your book. And what's next on your agenda? What's the sequel to this?
Well, we both have different sequels in mind. I guess I'll tell you about mine, and maybe Erez can tell you a little bit about his. So I'd like to generalize the thesis from using game theory to understand our odd beliefs and preferences to the hidden role that incentives and social pressures and social institutions writ large have on shaping our weird beliefs and preferences. I think Erez has in mind.
Yeah, my focus is to make this useful. So if we can understand our preferences and beliefs better, maybe we can use that to actually help people make better decisions, either for themselves or for society. And I've been working on that in particular around the question of prosociality. How do you get people to be more altruistic, to give more to charity, or to take their medication so they don't get other people sick and things like that?
Yes, I had that Will McCaskill coming on the show about effective altruism. His book is called What We Owe the Future. And I really like this movement. I've been following it previously with Peter Singer. And I donate to his group, in which he has, here are the top 20 charities you can give to, in which your money goes directly to the people that need it, as opposed to overhead and payroll and things like that. Some of these large organizations.
kind of a rational approach to charity is really effective.
We really like that organization as well. It's called The Life You Can Save.
Yeah, that's it. The Life You Can Save. That's right. Yeah, good.
Yeah.
All right, gentlemen. Thanks.